Hey, what's happening, folks? Welcome back to part 9 of my Raspberry Pi tutorial series, and today we're going to take a look at partitioning and formatting external drives to connect to your Pi, so stick around. Okay, so you just bought a new hard drive or thumb drive and you want to partition and format it to work with the Pi. Well, today we're going to do just that. And if you're not familiar with partitioning, basically partitioning is just a way to divide up a drive into smaller pieces. For example, you could make a 1 terabyte drive into 4 250 gig partitions. And different operating systems use different partition schemes, so you could just use the type that your system wants to see. For Windows systems, that would be like the master boot record type, or for a Mac, it'd be GUID, and Linux has its own special type. But today we're going to take an 8 gig card and divide it into 2 separate 4 gig partitions and format them for Linux. And there are some command line tools that we'll need to do this. The first is called fdisk. And fdisk will basically allow us to set up partitions on the disk. And it's a pretty advanced command, and I'm going to try to make it pretty easy for you to understand today. In the last tutorial, we learned how to find out what drive devices were connected to our system. So let's do that now. So sudo fdisk-l. I currently have an 8 gig SD card in a card reader plugged into one of the USB ports. And you can see here that fdisk is telling us that we have our old trusty friend dev/sda1 ready to go. And since this drive is currently set up for Windows FAT32, let's take a look at how we can change the partitions on this drive to make it a native Linux drive. And in order for fdisk to work its magic, we need to be super user root. So let's sudo fdisk/dev/sda. And in this case, you don't need the 1 because we're going to work with the main device, not just the first partition. And by leaving the 1 off, we're telling fdisk to work with the whole thing. And when we're done, we're going to have an SDA1, and we're also going to have an SDA2 partition. All right, so now we're met with a different looking command prompt, and it says to type M for help. So let's try that right now. Let's hit M and enter. And we have a bunch of things we can do here, but we're really only concerned with a handful of them. And let's take a look at the current partition table on this drive by using the P option. So let's go ahead and do that now. P, enter. And as you can see, this tells us that we have an 8 gig drive with a FAT32 format on it. And let's go ahead and change that so that we can rather suit it to Linux. And what we first want to do is get rid of that Windows partition. So let's use D to delete it. Okay, so that just deleted the first partition, and normally it would prompt you if you had more than one, but since there's only one partition there, it just went ahead and deleted the first one. And let's verify that that happened with P, so let's print out that. And there we go. You can see the drive info, the partition is now gone, however. And let's create a new Linux partition, and we do that with N. So N and enter. And we want the drive to be primary, or the partition rather. So let's do P for primary, and we're making partition 1, so 1. And it's asking us where we want the first sector to be, and we can just use the default here, which is 2048. And now is where we specify how large we want the partition size to be. And you can either tell it the last sector to use the entire drive, but since we only want 2 4 gig partitions, we're going to tell it how big we want the partition to be instead. So we're just going to say 4 gigs here, so plus 4 and G. And now let's make sure that that went okay, so let's do P again, so P and enter. And there you go, there's a 4 gig Linux partition, and we want to just repeat that process for our second partition. So let's do N again, so N, enter. And we want this one also to be primary, so primary. And this is going to be partition 2. And you can just use the default first sector here. It's basically just using the first sector that's after our first partition. And since we're not adding any more partitions, you can just use the default last sector. We could use plus 4G here again, but depending on how much space we have left, it can either waste space or not make enough. So we're just going to use the last sector, so hit enter, and then we'll do P again to make sure that that worked okay. And here you can see we ended up getting a little less than 4 gigs for our second partition, but that's okay. Our 8 gig drive is really only 7948 megabytes anyway, so we really couldn't technically even make 2 perfect 4 gig partitions for each. Now we're not done yet. We still have to write this info into the partition table. Our FAT32 partition is technically actually still there, and no changes have been made to the drive yet, so we could actually quit this if we wanted to and roll back to the FAT32 partition. But we're just telling FDisk what we want to do, and now we have to tell FDisk that we're ready to do it and we want to write it to the drive. So W will do that, and so let's go ahead and do that. W, enter, and there we go. So let's just make sure that everything we did was applied to the drive. So let's sudo fdisk-l. And there it is. We have 2 partitions, SDA1 and SDA2. Now we need to format them before we can mount them to the system and use them to store data. And the native Linux file system you probably want to use is ext4. And there are many other file systems. They all have their pros and cons, but for now, just stick with ext4. The next tool that we're going to want to use is mkfs, which is short for Make File System. And we need to be root to use it. So let's sudo first, then we're going to mkfs-t and the file system type, which in this case is ext4. And then we want to tell it what partition to format. So let's do dev/sda1. And that will work its magic. And pretty soon we have a formatted file system that is native to Linux with ext4. Now we want to do the same thing with the second partition, except instead of using SDA1, we use SDA2. So let's do that again. So sudo mkfs-t ext4/dev/sda2. Now we have both of these partitions and they are ready to be mounted. So we'll need 2 directories to mount them in. So let's go to our mnt directory, so cd/mnt. And I'm going to make just a couple of directories called part 1 and part 2, but you can name them whatever you want. So let's mkdir, then part 1 and part 2. And as you can see here, I'm making 2 directories with 1 command. And let's mount SDA1 to part 1 and SDA2 to part 2. So for right now, I'm just going to mount these with root permissions, but remember, if you want your regular Pi user to be able to use this drive, you should use the -o option and then specify the group ID and the user ID like we did in the last tutorial. So that'd be like GID equals Pi, comma, UID equals Pi, to make sure that you can use these with your Pi user. All right, so let's mount our first one. So we're going to need to be root, let's see, sudo mount/dev/sda1/mnt/part1. And that will mount the first partition into that folder or directory that we just created called part 1. And now let's do it for the second one. So sudo mount/dev/sda2, then /mnt/part2. All right, now let's try it out. So let's cd into part 1. So cd part 1. And let's just create a file here. So touch test1. And then let's ls to make sure that we got it. Yep, there we have a file named test1. And we've just created a file in the first partition. And now let's go to the second one. So let's cd and then ... So that takes us back 1 directory, and then part 2. And now let's touch test2. And there we go. There's a test file in our second partition. And the touch command that I'm using here, by the way, just it can update timestamps on files, or if the file doesn't exist in this case, it just creates one. So that's all I'm doing there. And that's basically it. You've just created 2 Linux partitions and mounted them. And when you're done with these new drives and you want to take it out of the USB port, don't forget to unmount it like we did in the last tutorial with umount. And it looks like I'm just over the 10-minute mark for this tutorial, so I'm going to end it here. I have some more stuff coming up on partitioning and mounting and stuff like that, so I'm probably going to do a part 9B coming up after this. So stick around, make sure you subscribe, and as always, guys, thank you so much for watching.